begin today's webinar Wednesday, in which this week's topic, we are looking at how we can communicate testing results with our stakeholders. Of course, I am your host for this webinar Wednesday. My name is Benjamin Taylor. I work at Go Bigger, which is where you're watching this, of course. And this week, we're going to look at how we can communicate testing results with different stakeholders, as well as the challenges that arise from that. It's a kind of a crucial key area in my eyes, and especially how we talk about testing in general. And I do have some really great experiences in this sort of area. So I hope I can share that with you today. Plus, as I have said, there is a voucher for the Robot Framework Certified Professional course that we have developed that you will be joining me in as a lecturer. So if you like my webinars, if you want to try a course, then now is the perfect time to both get yourself a brand new qualification and join me on a course at a heavily discounted price. But we'll get into that at the very end of today. So what are we actually covering in this webinar? Well, I want to discuss the difficulties that come with sharing test results in general. To understand how we can do this, we need to know why it's a problem in the first place. Then I want to have a look at how we can prepare some of the data that we're using in terms of our testing reports. And finally, how do we present the data themselves? As that is truly a key component of actually handing over the testing data to our stakeholders, to our clients. We need to actually be able to present it properly to them. But first, considering this is more of a cerebral topic, and it's sort of important to really understand what I'm saying and why I'm saying it, I first want to tell you just a little bit about me, my experiences. So I am a certified ISTQB tester. I have the foundation level certification, and I am looking to obtain more certifications as well in the near future. So I am a tester. I am also a Robot Framework Certified Professional, one of the sort of first batch of people to obtain the certification, and definitely one of the very few first people to become an accredited trainer. We have our accredited course, which is what the voucher that we'll provide is for. So I am quite knowledgeable in test automation in these areas, as well as just testing in general. And I do have experience in sort of ongoing support or testing positions, in which I managed several clients at once for their ongoing support, testing, making sure that everything was working, and consistently, if it wasn't, then investigating that, finding out why. And in that role, I also did client communications, primarily focusing on a monthly reporting feedback. This was more so in the ongoing support role, so development had stopped, it had ceased, and then it was this sort of ongoing feedback of, well, we found these issues popped up, here's how we looked into them, here's how we fixed them, kind of deal. So I have a bit of background in this area, and if I do say so myself, I think my monthly reports for the clients went over really well. They all seem to like me, so hopefully I can share some of that knowledge with you about how I did it. But first, what are test results? These are the things that we're actually communicating to the clients. And simply put, these are just, as the name kind of implies, they're the outcomes of our tests, both from an automated sense and a manual sense. Test results are generated automatically if we're using automated tests, of course, but for manual tests, we will need to actually note down what occurred, if this is within expectations or pass, fail, that kind of thing. Test results themselves identify what defects, if any, are actually present in the software that we're testing. Of course, these could be defects in our testing code itself, but these could also be defects within the software, which is the important one that we want to look at. And just taking a step back from this sort of high level of looking at defects, looking at outcomes, this just showcases our overall testing progress. How far through testing are we? How is testing progressing? Are we mostly passing all of our tests? In which case, great, we're probably pretty close to being ready to release or having a sprint done. Or are there more tests still to come? Are we still pretty low in the test completion. Well, that's sort of an idea of how it's progressing. As well, testing reports and testing results are also great ways to highlight and identify any disruptions to progress. So if our overall testing progress isn't keeping up with where we think we should be, we need to identify why that's the case and explain it. And we normally do this with, regular updates, inform the client, inform the project manager what's occurring. But it's important that we still highlight these and make sure we think about highlighting these when we actually make our test reports. So the difficulties of actually sharing our testing reports is that, unfortunately, the simplest way that we can share our test reports is just provide all of our automated and manual test reports to our client. We can just hand it over to them and we'll be good, right? Well, no, sadly, I don't think we can actually do this, as this might work for technical stakeholders, and it might work on very small projects, but beyond that, and if we include multiple tools, especially if we're looking at manual testing as well, it doesn't really work all that well. That's because we're overloading our stakeholders with a whole bunch of information. So it's like, whoa, I don't know how to read all of these, 20 at least reports you've given me. What do these mean? What's important? So we can try and summarize this, of course. We can try and summarize it up and tell them what is important. But if we summarize it too much, then we may end up finding ourselves lacking in overall detail. So, okay, let's instead provide a summary, but really explore, really go in depth, and suddenly you found yourself stuck in unnecessary detail. It's an hour into sharing test reports, testing results, and the client is just sitting there going, I don't know what you're trying to tell me. You don't want that. You don't want that. You don't want to go over detail too much. You don't want to go under detail too. So we have difficulties here. We have a trouble. We have issues because we as testers love details. We love to know all the nitty-gritty details because they help us write our defect reports. They help us get in contact with the developers that we need to. We love the details that help us test better and help fix the software to make it even stronger. However, compared to stakeholders though, they love visual simplicity. They love being able to understand what we're talking about at a moment's notice. They don't need a whole bunch of technical information, although they may sometimes want that. So it's a sort of balance between how much detail should we have and how easy should it be to approach. And truly, the question is, when we talk about sharing testing reports and results, how can we make the best of both worlds? And that is the key topic that I really wanted to get into today. To which, as we talk about preparing the data, we have an important note to make, is that there is no one-stop solution. There is no easy way to prepare or present the testing data in the test reports. Instead, we need to accommodate for our audience as well as what we're doing. Namely, I think we should ask the following questions regarding how we prepare our data for our test reports. First up, what data would the stakeholder consider important? This should be really quite obvious, I would feel, to a lot of people, in that the stakeholder wants to see some kind of important information, so that should be front and center, and it should definitely be included in your report. Following that, how difficult is it to get that data? If we're looking at an automated tool, it may be quite simple. But if we're looking at manual, or if we're looking at some complex intermingling of data, then that could be actually quite difficult to extract out. Speaking of extracting out, what sources does our data come from? Does our data come from just for one source, or are we looking at multiple sources, multiple machines, multiple different frameworks? Where does it actually come from, and how difficult is it to get it? And finally, how deep should the data go? How deep of a dive should we look into it to analyze what's occurring, or should we just have a more cursory glance? It depends, once again, on who your client stakeholder is, their level of expertise, because you want to try and balance your love of details, but their love of visual simplicity. So to go into these questions a little deeper. So what data would the stakeholder consider important? And when we think about this, we need to remember that stakeholders care about the overall progress of testing. What do I mean by this? I mean, they look at the test pass rate. They want to know how many tests are actually passing. If 100% of tests are passing, fantastic. If only 20% are passing, okay, that's a concern. Let's talk about this and how and why these tests aren't passing. Then, stakeholders also want to know about defect severity distribution. We can classify defects in a severity sense, where we have a priority 1 defect, which is it's breaking that component, it's completely broken, to priority 4 of it sometimes gives incorrect or doesn't work in the exact way that we need it to be, but it is workable. And so defect severity distribution means breaking up the project into its sort of component chunks. Where are the defects located? Because you could have one chunk, one section that has a variety of lower priority defects. And so it may have 20 defects, but they're all at a low priority. So we can worry about fixing those later on in the project. But we may have another section that has just a handful, maybe 2 priority 2s or 1s, really high priority defects. And that's like, okay, that takes priority. We need to resolve that now, because that can cause a lot of issues. Then they want to know the defect closure rates. So we've made all these defects, we have their severities. How many have we actually closed out? If we haven't closed out that many, then we need to explain why we haven't closed out that many. Maybe because we were actually focusing on the really high priority ones, and primarily, we still have just a lot of P4s, priority 4s, which we haven't touched yet. Maybe that's it. But it's important to discuss and bring up, okay, here's the closure rates. Maybe you could even break it down by priority levels. That's a great little idea too. And then there's the BDD test cases. Because BDD test cases are not always, but primarily and often written actually by the stakeholders themselves, or at least the end users. So if you're reporting to that stakeholder, it's actually a really great idea to include their own behavior-driven development test cases in that report, because then they can look at it and go, oh yeah, I remember working on this and drafting it up. So they want to see that feedback, because not only does it mean, yeah, there's another test pass, but it actually builds and strengthens the relationship between the stakeholder and the testers to say, hey, we're on your side, stakeholders. We also want to do this as best we can. We want to meet your expectations of how the software should function. So really key thing to include there. Looking at how difficult it is to get this data that we need. First thing, of course, does our tool automatically collect this data? If our tool automatically collects it, perfect. It's really easy. We don't have to worry. But if it doesn't, then we have to think about, okay, how do we actually get this data then? What do we need to do? Do we need to make some API calls? Do we need to look into the automatic logs and extract that sort of information out? How do we do this? And the important question as well, are we even using testing tools to begin with? Because if we're not using formalized testing tools that may not create this data, then where's the data coming from? How can we get it ourselves? Do we have to use other tools and metrics to collect this data as we then do our tests? Maybe. And speaking of recording data, what are we recording from manual testing? Automated tests will record a lot of information themselves, sure. But for manual testing, we need to keep track of everything ourselves. How do we do that? And how do we get that data in a usable format? And then, this is more when we summarize testing reports, but still, are we getting complete statistics on literally everything that we've done, or are we just getting some sort of general run-by-run information? Because if we're just getting general run-by-run information, then that really limits the depth we can go into for this data and how easy it may be to extract. But if we're getting literally everything, then that may mean it's quite hard to actually get the data we want, but all of it is there. So once again, bit of a trade-off. You have to use the testing tools that you are using and sort of figure out how they best work to know. Then we come to what sources does our data come from? Are we only testing with one testing tool? Because if so, perfect. Hopefully that has some reporting aspects, or at least some recording. So we can get our information from there, and it should be able to work pretty well and give us a good overall image. But unfortunately, testing isn't always as simple, and we may be testing over multiple disciplines with things like a graphics user interface or using API calls, looking at manual testing as well as just generally automated testing. How are we testing? Where does it come from? What tools are we using? And this is one that's especially true for automated testing. Can we get data from both the testing machine that we're on right now and our target machine, if they are different? Oftentimes, part of the process will be relegated to the sort of client or testing machine as well as our target server machine. And so we'll need to know, or we'll want to know, how those machines are working at that specific moment when we make requests. Are we leaving the entire sort of generation of the web page and filtering and all of that to our client target machine? Or are we handling that server side? If we're handling that server side, what does that mean? Does it take maybe a second and lag the site out in the meantime? Or are we just leaving it to a client machine where a client machine can lag out for a couple of seconds as it processes that information? It's important to understand how we're actually testing, and importantly, if we are testing from multiple machines, then we should probably try and get the data from those multiple machines. And the last question from preparing data is, how deep should our data go? And this is the truly difficult one because it really depends on the technical knowledge of your stakeholders. So for general rule I would try and follow in terms of how deep you should go with your data is you should always have enough to satisfy, but too little to cause concern. I think that's a sort of funny way of thinking about it, but I do think it is a sort of great explanatory method. Because you want to give them enough information that they can see, oh yes, you are doing the proper testing, everything's looking good. But you don't want to give them too much information because, as sort of the example I gave earlier, they'll be 45 minutes in listening to the tests and going, you're still talking about these tests that are going well, but why are you telling me all this? Is there something wrong later on? Has something happened that you're trying to tell me because I'm not following? So don't give them too much information because you're just gonna completely lose them, and you don't want to do that. But give them enough information that they can follow along, they can understand sort of where you're coming from, how you're testing. And I find the easiest way to do that is to look and find some short stories. Not to flex your creative writing, of course, but to find stories that relate to the data and can explain how the data has been obtained or what happened to cause this bit of data. Maybe this could be a defect that you explain on why it occurred or how it transpired, what it did to the code, what it did in the process. But you can find little short stories that help humanize what's been happening and how you've resolved it. Although, of course, don't explain every short story. You don't need a short story for literally every defect, but just pick a couple, maybe even like 2, and you can go into depth on why those occurred and how you resolved them. And that's how you can sort of think about preparing your data, but how do we present our data? And, well, we want to ask some more questions. Because we want to ask more questions. Namely, what information should be present in our presentation or reports, as well as what should our report prioritize? Because So we have a lot of information, but how do we sort of focus where we want our attention? Then, what ways can we use to show off the different parts of our reports that we're looking at? Then, what additional information can be added? So I've got our main stuff, but what else is interesting to the client or to the stakeholder? What else do they want to see? And lastly, an important one, how do we present bad results? Because it may happen that we actually need to present some bad results. How do we discuss that? How do we actually show that off ourselves? So first though, what information should be present? Well, as you might already thinking, this is very similar to what data the stakeholder actually considers important in our testing reports. And namely, this information should be front and center. It needs to be there, it needs to be clear. As well as if, however, you're making a report allows for it, it's a good idea to have multiple data views to highlight sort of different aspects of this information. Break it down, make it useful, make it so they can actually understand how this is working together. If we have a look at a Power BI example that I described, I used Power BI when I was creating my monthly reports. It's a fantastic tool, quite complex to use. You do need a lot of data for it. But once you have it set up, and you can make some really great looking graphs, and they're interactable too. But I'm having a look at this one. This is just for a sales process, I believe. So it tells you how they're going year on year compared to previous and overall. We can filter by region, we can get the total amount of sales, we can get our expectations in line. So there's ways of really examining and looking at how these are actually working, and they tell a story themselves, and they give the client the information that they really want. So then we move on to our next question. So what should our report prioritize that we're creating? And I'd say the testing results and reports that we make should just really provide more details on the tests themselves. What are the tests doing? How are they functioning? If they're all passing, great. If they're not all passing, then why is that the case? Or which ones are failing? And a great way to do this is just to break down components into sort of respective graphs. Maybe we're testing we have each individual feature on its own graph that we can identify and have a look at. Maybe we're looking at those priority levels and defect closure rates. We can have a look at a lot of information that is dependent on what your client wants to see. And speaking of what your client wants to see, your client probably wants to see a good collection of percentages and statistics. That helps break things down. That means they can get a good understanding of how tests are progressing and how the overall progress is progressing on development. Then we come to our third question. So how can we show off the different parts of our reports? This is a really simple question because it has a great answer. Graphs. We want graphs. We want pie charts. We want burn down charts. We want bar graphs. We want as many visual types of displaying relevant information as possible. Because remember that whilst we're testers, we're testing this product for the client, for our project manager, we're handling these testing reports to them. They don't, our stakeholders don't exist in a vacuum where they just manage it themselves. No, remember, they are also responsible to others that are even further disconnected from this project. So the client stakeholder may not fully understand the minutia of how the development works, of how the testing works. And if they don't understand that, then try to imagine what their managers are like regarding this project. Chances are they're even further detached. They don't really understand the complete thing itself. So make it simple. Use visual elements as much as you can when presenting your data, because they're going to have to go back to their managers and explain how it's going. So if you can actually make some testing reports for them, I think they'll really, really appreciate it. So just make it easy. Then, what additional information can be added? Well, going back to how we can prepare the data, this is where we look at our individual stories. We found our stories that explain why certain events happened, and the important thing now is to find the data that backs up these stories and how we present them. As an example of a story that we can tell is that a feature was failing tests. Why was this feature failing tests? Well, it's because the feature wasn't fully developed yet during a Loga testing time period. It was reprioritized to a later sprint. Maybe the developer who is responsible left and didn't share knowledge. Those are kinds of things. Those are little stories that don't put blame on anyone. We don't want to blame anyone for why this occurred, but we can explain why these events happened in the first place. Finding these additional bits of information and stories can also allow us further possibility of deep diving and really diving in down to what happened and getting some sort of fun tidbits about the reporting process and the testing process itself. And especially if you want to look at deep diving, then I think the best thing you can do in order to present your reports is hold a meeting. Hold regular meetings at the end of sprints or monthly or whatever works best for your team. Hold meetings to discuss reports with the client stakeholders, so they are kept up to date on how everything is going, as well as the whole team. And it's a great time where stakeholders can ask questions as they need to. They can communicate directly with the developers, with the testers. It's a really great idea where vast majority of the questions we answered after presentation, with the report, but any follow-ups can be done right then and there. And finally, importantly, how do we present bad results? Because bad results feel bad. If we get bad results, then it means that we've done wrong, right? Well, no, because remember, bad results aren't a failure in and of themselves. They can come from failures, but they themselves are not a failure. Bad results happen, and as testers, as professionals, we need to accept that, and we need to know how we deal with it. To which I'd say the simplest way to deal with it is just explain the circumstances. How did these bad results come about? Because maybe people were sick or on holidays, and therefore deadlines weren't met in time. Maybe deadlines need to be expanded in general. Maybe people were called into other projects or areas and needed to work on those, and that caused some delays and issues. It's a bad result, sure, but you can explain it in a way that really does explain why it occurred in the first place. It's not just, oh, we don't know. No, it's, we know exactly what happened. Here's why. Not blaming anyone for it, but here's why it happened in the first place. And then that brings the dialogue of how can we prevent this in the future. This could also be because there were a whole bunch of smaller issues that just took place and derailed this section of the project. Small things happen. A lot of things can just come up randomly, or semi-randomly, maybe reprioritizing situations, user stories. And so these smaller issues could lead to a large situation where we do have bad results. And that's okay, we have to explain that too. Just importantly, when we talk about bad results, stay positive. Just try your best to stay positive, because bad results will happen. But bad results are temporary, because most of the time, you will be allowed to continue on, and you can actually fix your results, or you can fix those errors, you can fix those defects, and then you'll have good results, and you'll have a great story. Important thing with bad results is that you may have a month of bad results, but then the next meeting you have, go back to those bad results and talk about how you've progressed since then. Maybe you had 50% of your tests failing 1 month, but then the following month you're down to only 25, and you can say, actually, we've been going through all of our failing test cases and have found that, first of all, a portion of these were actually from result of bad tests, and then another portion was reflecting bad code in the project, so we'll fix that up. That's how you can talk about testing. And bad results may be bad right then and there, but you got to stay strong, got to hold through, because then you can make them great. And that sort of covers today's Webinar Wednesday. So if there are any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'll be happy to answer them. But as I wait for questions to go on in the chat, I will say first that if you enjoyed our webinar and you are not already following us on LinkedIn, then why not go ahead and give us a follow? It is greatly appreciated. It's a really small thing you can do for us, but it means so much. Plus, you'll get to stay up to date with our latest webinar announcements, as well as our new developments that we're doing. Speaking of new developments, if you want to stay up to date with those and check out our currently available courses and workshops, then you can always go over to our shop page to have a look there. Not only do we have the Robot Framework Certified Professional course, as well as a Robot Framework hands-on workshop, we are close to releasing another brand new course. Plus, we have some consultation opportunities available in case you want to get in contact with us directly, or just want to talk about the Robot Framework Certified Professional course as well, if on a more one-to-one level. This is a quick 15-minute call. It would be lovely to have you and be talking, and would love to talk through what we offer for you. Plus, if you want to really stay up to date with us, you can always subscribe to our monthly newsletter at Grow Bigger. This monthly newsletter keeps you up to date with everything at Go Bigger, plus what's happening in the software testing world as well. We only email you once a month. You can always unsubscribe if you want, but keep up to date with us and all things software testing. And as the reward for making it way all through the webinar, why not go ahead and get 540 euros off your Robot Framework Certified Professional course with the code Summer Sale on the checkout. You can use the code Summer Sale on any Robot Framework Certified Professional course, regardless if it has an exam or not, and you can combine this voucher with the early bird special as well to save another 10% off. So what's to lose? You can book any Robot Framework Certified Professional course from now until the end of the year. 540 euros off, plus another 10% if you book more than 2 weeks in advance. It's a deal. Go for it, check it out, and we're really looking forward to seeing you there. For now though, that wraps up this Webinar Wednesday of where we learned how to communicate our testing reports to our stakeholders. I hope you've enjoyed, and hope you're looking forward to next week's webinar, in which we'll look at how we can perform AI testing in general with test automation and just in general speaking. Looking at primarily the ISTQB AI Tester certification. Looking forward to seeing you there. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you soon.